so intimately, it's sometimes something we're not terribly familiar with since it happens only every 3 years. So I'm going to give you a very broad brush, and then we're going to report back on some of the highlights. It would take us months to cover everything, I think, even though it happened in only 9 days. So General Convention, to remind you, is the governing body of the Episcopal Church. It meets every 3 years to consider a very wide range of matters important to the mission and ministry of the Episcopal Church here and throughout the world. And it's a bicameral legislature. It was created by the same people who crafted this country at the same time. So we have this wonderful bicameral system. On one hand, we have the House of Deputies with over 800 members. There are usually about 4 lay and 4 clergy deputies from every diocese. And then there is the House of Bishops, which is made up of 300, or up to about 300 active bishops and resigned bishops. So these 2 houses make up General Convention. So there's a president of the House of Deputies, Gay Clark Jennings, and then there is the presiding bishop, Michael Curry, who presides over the House of Bishops and over both houses when we convene together. This is going to be a broad brush here. So a resolution, and there were more than 500, no, there were up 496, I think. A resolution could begin in either house, or it could begin in a committee, or it could begin out in a diocese. In order to carry, it would need to pass both houses. Does that sound familiar? Make sense? We had, as I said, nearly 500 resolutions to consider within only 9 legislative days. Most resolutions were resolved by a simple majority, with each one of the deputies, each one of us having 1 vote. There are times, however, when a vote by orders is either required by the Constitution, canons, or called for. And those votes are weighted toward conserving rather than, they're slightly weighted toward conserving rather than changing what is and has been. It requires that the church be deliberate and particularly intentional. So in those cases, each diocese has a single lay vote instead of 4, and a single clergy vote instead of 4. And in order for a resolution to be adopted or passed, to carry, it needs to have at least 3 out of 4 lay people and 3 out of 4 lay people to carry the lay vote, 3 out of 4 clergy to carry the clergy vote. You see what happens here is if it's divided, rather than having 2 for and 2 against in one order, if there's 2 and 2, that's considered divided and it doesn't promote, it doesn't carry. So there's a default there that builds a little bit of puts the brakes on a little bit for the really weighty matters that we might feel we need to take more care with. Although we do take care with everything. In addition to the 2 houses, there were more than 24 committees meeting to sort out and to sound out all the issues that would eventually come to a vote, ranging from, but by no means limited to, prayer book, racial reconciliation, stewardship of creation, the budget, and well beyond. Evan and Samantha will speak to some of those issues in just a few moments. Over and over throughout the convention, we are called to follow Jesus in the way of love, that overarching message of the presiding bishop. There was a Eucharist every day and often special worship to call God's attention and ours to issues dear to our hearts. The bishops against gun violence held prayer vigils, and our presiding bishop led us in midday prayers under an unflinching gaze of the Texas sun outside Hutto Detention Center, where detention center for women refugees, many of whom had been separated from their children at the borders. Our mornings began at 7:30 and often went till 9 or 10 at night. It was intense, poignant, fun, boring, exhausting, inspiring, and deeply, deeply meaningful. It was a great privilege to serve. We were proud of our deputation, Arkansas, with its relative diversity of age, experience, and gifts. We were half from Northwest Arkansas, half from Central Arkansas, with alternates from the Delta and Northeast Arkansas. We were half women, half men. We ranged in age from 21 to 77. Thomas Alexander turned 22 before the convention was over. It was his second general convention. So his first one, was he 18 when he went? And Thomas, from Christ Church, Little Rock, Thomas was positioned as vice chair of the prayer book, liturgy, and hymnal committee. One of the most, well, I hate to layer them, so maybe I shouldn't, but a committee lots of folks want to get on. We'll put it that way. And he did a wonderful job representing us there and informing our deputation about the votes. Our eldest was Robert L. Brown, who retired, just 4 or 5 years ago from the Arkansas. He was Associate Justice of the Arkansas Supreme Court, also very, very active in the Episcopal Church in this diocese and across the country. And since I was not assigned to a committee, many first-timers are not, I had the privilege of attending various committee hearings between all of these legislative sessions. And I honestly felt at times like I had a contemporary view of the early church councils. There were plenty of times when the hair just raised on the back of my neck with the movement of the Spirit. There would be 20, 25 people on each committee, each one bringing the treasures of their mind and life experience, the treasures of their hearts to bear, often in opposition to one another. And these would come out. There would be informed scriptural references. There would be highly developed theology. There would be great hearts and minds at work. And they would be sort of circling an issue. And then something would happen. And I swear you could feel the Holy Spirit at work, and suddenly there was this spirit, this sense of direction, this aha. Somebody would get hit with an aha, and it would all be collected together, and there would be a creative way forward. It was remarkable. The committee on the prayer book and liturgy, we would hear, whether we were in that committee or down the hall, you couldn't help but hear when they would break into song. They would get to an impasse or some moment where they had nowhere else to go, and one of them would just begin singing, and then they would all begin singing. And at the end of raising their voices together in this collective song, there would be a silence. And the silence itself was respected. And how often out of that silence would come something remarkable. It was a privilege to happen. It happened over and over. And again, it was such a privilege to be there as a witness and participant. One highlight of the convention came as just exactly that sort of surprise. The Episcopal Church had abandoned our brothers and sisters in Cuba in 1966. The House of Bishops, acting contrary to their own call and good order, had severed our relationship with the church in Cuba during a fearful political period. Apparently, they were concerned that it would seem to be supporting a communist regime, and so we pulled away. It was wrong. It left the church in Cuba feeling, in the words of one witness, alone and abandoned by their mother church. And they wished more than anything for these past 50-some years to come home. I don't know why they even wanted to come back after being treated that way, but they did. So back in 1966, the ties were cut. The church in Cuba struggled and yet remained faithful. Far from being a pawn of the state, the church in Cuba is acting and did act where the government would not and will not. It has been a major supporter of the arts among young people and has provided opportunities for children to excel academically. Under the leadership of Bishop Griselda, the church is growing. They're providing villages with purified water so they can be healthy and safe. They've torn out all the gardens around churches to plant crops to feed the people of the villages. They've created safe spaces for women and for children. There were significant impediments to readmission, and it looked unlikely until a few bishops began to find a way. Again, those aha moments, those moments of insight and inspiration, until finally others followed. And when it came time for a vote, the entire House of Bishops voted unanimously to restore its relationship to the church in Cuba. There were tears. There was spontaneous singing of the doxology, praise to God. There was a standing ovation as Bishop Griselda was greeted and seated in the House of Bishops. And the very thing happened the next day in the House of Deputies. It was one of the great privileges and highlights. Oh, my goodness. St. Paul's had a strong presence beyond the deputation. Our rector, Evan, was their 3-time deputy from Alabama. It's clear that he and the president of the House of Deputies have a playful relationship with great mutual respect. Samantha Haycock was there, everywhere actually, it seemed. She was lobbying on behalf of Forma, which is a fantastic network of leaders supporting a strong and healthy and informed laity. And of course, Lowell was there for a couple of days, but he remains a presence even in his absence. So I'm going to let them fill you in on some of the other things that we considered in our resolutions and our life together.
Thanks, Suzanne. As she said, yes, I was there. My last duty as a priest in Alabama was to be at General Convention. That's a ministry that matters a lot to me, and I wanted to serve, and I spoke to the other deputies in Alabama, and they agreed to let me serve in that way, and I was glad that they did. I don't want to miss the chance to say so much of what we read about, even those of us who are there, read about in blogs and emails and newsletters and then in diocesan websites, focuses on contentious issues where votes are counted carefully. Not enough time is spent celebrating and reporting moments like the seating of the deputation from Cuba, where it is one voice in the church that welcomes them back. That's what makes convention clearly a spirit-filled moment, as Suzanne described. I want to say yes, absolutely. But my job is to report to you on the opposite end of the spectrum, maybe the most contentious part of convention, which was the conversation around the reform or the revision to the Book of Common Prayer. Y'all might have heard about that leading up to convention. You might have noticed it during and even after convention. And I just want to tell you a little bit about where we left everything at this General Convention and a little bit about what that means for us at St. Paul's and in the Diocese of Arkansas. In addition to the work that happens once every 3 years at convention, there are lots of little groups appointed by the Episcopal Church to carry on the work of convention in between conventions. And one of those groups is the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music, whose job it was to come to convention with a plan for revising the prayer book. They were caught a little off guard by that mandate, it seems, because they came to us not with a plan, but with a choice. And they said to the convention, all right, we could start the process of revising a prayer book if you really, really want to, or we could spend the next 3 years or longer taking our current prayer book seriously and honoring it and plumbing its depths before we start with a revision. And so that was kind of the will we or won't we attitude when we got there. let me share with you what I sense are some of the reasons behind that conversation. And if I missed anything, I hope you'll join with me. Part of that, some of that is familiar to you. Part of that is for gender-inclusive language. Our 79 prayer book talks about God as if God is only male. Of course, God is not only male. God is not gendered. The incarnate Son of God is male, Jesus. But our prayer book uses gender-specific language for God. And there's a strong movement in our church to reflect the breadth of our understanding of who God is. Another reason is marriage equality. There are some dioceses in the Episcopal Church that up until this convention, the bishop refused to allow same-sex marriage in the diocese. And the idea is that if we put it in the prayer book, bishops don't have that option anymore. So there was a little bit of that going on. Language translation is also important. If you come to the 11 o'clock service, you might hear a little bit of Spanish because one of our baptismal candidates' families is a Latino family, and they speak primarily Spanish. But what you might not know is that the Spanish prayer book is a really poor representation of the English prayer book. They translated it word for word rather than thought for thought, and so a native speaker looks at that and thinks, why does it sound like an 8-year-old is trying to speak to me the beautiful words of Cranmer? Some 8-year-olds have that gift, but not all 8-year-olds have that gift. And so there's a desire for a living translation, not only into Spanish, but also into French Creole and the other languages of the church. There's some other theological arguments, baptismal theology, Eucharistic theology. Another big one is the cost. It costs a lot of money for a church like St. Paul's to get rid of all their old prayer books and buy new ones. That's costly. And churches like St. Paul's might be able to afford that, but there are other churches nearby who would really struggle to pay for that. Also, I think there is a desire among many in our church for a legacy. And there's some ego that enters into that, and some people who have had a seat at the table for a really long time want to be able to lay their heads on their pillows and close their eyes for the last time, knowing that they gave the Episcopal Church a new prayer book. And so all of those forces are working. Well, the result was a little bit of both. And it really was a compromise that left very few people unequivocally happy, but left the church as a whole pretty pleased. And the decision was to do this, to authorize the creation of a task force to begin the process of revising the prayer book, to bring us a new prayer book. That will be at least 9 years away, 3 to begin, 3 more to try, and 3 more to approve, at least 9 years away. So we got a little time. The other bit of the compromise was they decided to memorialize the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. No one knows what that means. But Andy Doyle, Bishop of Texas, in a moment that maybe Holy Spirit led, convinced some of his recalcitrant bishops to join that, said, let's acknowledge that we like this prayer book, that it says who God is and who we are in a good way, and although we need to revise it, let's not get rid of it. So let's memorialize it to ensure its continued use. We don't know what that means. It could mean that churches down the street refuse to accept the new prayer book. We're using what will, I guess, be the old prayer book then. We're using the old prayer book. We don't know yet. But there's enough division in our church that people weren't ready to step away completely from the 79 prayer book that we've memorialized it. The two other bits of that compromise, one, money was requested to do a new translation of our current prayer book so that even before the new prayer book comes out, whenever it comes out, we've got a good translation of what we got. And the fourth bit of compromise was that, as you might have read, bishops in those dioceses where they did not approve same-sex marriage can no longer say no to their diocese. It's the rector's decision. And if the bishop in that diocese says no, the rector, after consulting with her or his bishop, may seek the oversight of another bishop at their current bishop's directive to provide that pastoral oversight. So most of those issues were addressed in one way or another. We're starting the process. We don't know where it's going to go. But I would say more than anything, a sense of compromise pervaded that. Anything else you want to add about that? All right. We're going to ask for questions at the end. Who's next? Samantha.
So as Suzanne mentioned, I was at General Convention with the organization Forma, which is a network of people working across the church, mostly lay people, but some clergy, who do the work of discipleship. So creating followers of Jesus, raising people up to be spiritually formed, to be disciples. And so I spent most of my time following legislation that tracked formation and ministry, which is not as exciting as prayer book conversations, but is essential, but is not what I'm going to talk to you about this morning. What I want to talk to you about this morning is what the church calls safeguarding and Title IV, which we would more clearly name as sexual misconduct and sexual harassment. The church entered into this conversation on sexual misconduct and sexual harassment most recently, following the secular movement, Me Too, right? So I'm sure all of you have seen this in the news. And at the time that this was sort of trending in the news, the presiding bishop and the president of the House of Deputies announced that during our general convention, we would enter into a conversation on sexual misconduct and sexual harassment in the church. And during our time together, this conversation started with a litany of repentance, where all of the people at General Convention were invited to gather in worship for a liturgy which would seek to confess the ways that the church has failed to adequately address sexual misconduct, confess the ways in which the church, the clergy, and the bishops have been negligent in addressing sexual misconduct, and a series of lamentations. Speaking for myself, I was left speechless during the service. It was a very challenging service. A part of the service, they had called for individuals to submit stories of sexual harassment and misconduct. And from those stories, the individuals were kept confidential, but they took portions of those stories and read them aloud to the congregation that was gathered. A bishop would rise and go to the altar and read aloud the excerpt of the story of misconduct, from sexual harassment to rape to ongoing abuse, perpetrated by bishops, by clergy, and by lay people. And it was very difficult to listen to those stories. I left the service very angry, feeling very raw. But I think it was an important step of confession, of naming an issue which we have in our church and in the world also, and a good way to begin thinking about what we might do to repair and restore the relationships and the wrongs that we have done, either by act or by silence. So part of the General Convention legislation, there were over 50 resolutions put forward to address the sexual misconduct and sexual harassment. Many of them were very particular, nuanced editing of the canons. So our canons dictate how the church operates, and Title IV of the canons addresses sexual misconduct. There were a dozen resolutions which made minute changes to those canons to do things like provide transparency, clarity on the definition of sexual misconduct, more accountability, addressing how sometimes there's misrepresentation during the ordination process, canonical language to protect whistleblowers so that you can no longer fire or demote someone who reports sexual misconduct, protection from retaliation, more protection for individuals in order to keep their identities confidential, and an important move to open the statute of limitations. So normally there's a statute of 10 years limitation So you can only report up to 10 years following the violation. The church moved to open the statute of limitations temporarily between January 1st of 2019 until December 31st, 2021, so that individuals can come forward to make reports regardless of the time or when it occurred. So those were some really particular things that happened. Another type of resolution that comes forward during convention is sort of like a statement of belief or a theological understanding. So some resolutions are very particular and actionable, and some of them are more wide-ranging. And one of those would be a resolution called Seeking Truth, Reconciliation, and Restoration. And this resolution included a confession of the sin of gender-based discrimination, harassment, and violence, acknowledgement that we have a culture of excuses, justification, enabling, and dishonesty, a confession that we have not heard from women with the goal of justice, and a turn towards seeking restoration. This resolution then went on to establish a task force for women, truth, and reconciliation, which over the next 3 years will do a survey of the church to learn more about how gender-based discrimination, harassment, and violence happens within the church. There will be an internal audit by an outside auditor, a review and a report, and then following those things, a development of a process for reconciliation and restoration. Another important resolution seeks to end the silence. So the convention moved to state that non-disclosure agreements in times of sexual misconduct, non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality provisions, though they may be useful legal tools, do not allow for transparency, for uncovering patterns of abuse, or providing adequate opportunities for healing of individuals and communities, and that these sorts of agreements unduly burden those who are harmed. And so this resolution called for a study of these sorts of agreements, how frequently they're used within Title IV investigations and actions, and to make a recommendation of how Title IV might be amended in order to seek more transparency and more adequate opportunities for healing. Another resolution called for compassionate care of victims, changing the canon to require that those who report misconduct must be provided with assistance by a mental health professional with adequate skills. And this is in acknowledgement that reporting misconduct is courageous and sacrificial, and also serves the church as our goal to be a whole and loving place. And finally, in regards to the Me Too movement in the church, the sexual harassment task force was established, and their goal is to develop a curriculum which can be used by congregation and diocese to understand sexual harassment, in particular how it shows up in the church, and to create a model policy for dioceses. So to create a policy that dioceses can adapt to use in the local context to address sexual harassment and sexual harassment reports in the church. Did I miss anything?
So there were lots of other topics, and if we had another hour, Suzanne would talk about some creation work, and Samantha would talk about some racial reconciliation work. I would talk about some pension work, and then there is a whole other round of things, but we want to make sure that you have a chance to ask questions. Any questions about not only what we've discussed today, but any aspect of convention or our parish's relationship with convention? Any questions at all? Yes.
Samantha, I'm just curious about the statute of limitations only being temporarily lifted. What was the reason for only temporary?
think it's a matter of realizing that until now, the church hasn't always been a safe place to come forward. So with these safeguards, with this intention, we're hoping to provide an opportunity for women, and some of these were boys and men too, but to come forward and tell their stories, knowing they will be honored and that they'll receive the care that they've longed for.
So let me say that the canons state very clearly that if the victim is a minor, that there is no statute of limitations. And I don't know exactly why there would be a 10-year statute of limitations, other than the fact that after enough time has gone by, it's difficult for us to be sort of honest and open about facts. But we kind of acknowledge that given the tidal wave of desire to tell these stories, that we needed to start fresh, very publicly say anybody who has a story over the next 3 years, there's no statute of limitations. Who knows what convention will do when they next meet? They might consider that again, but probably for the same reason that other crimes have a statute of limitations in the civil world. Other questions? Yeah, got it. Well, the problem is that we record this, and it goes on the web, and everybody wants to hear your question.
Was there any discussion of church-sponsored chaplains in the military and their behavior?
In terms of sexual misconduct? I didn't hear anything particular to that. But I know that all Episcopal clergy are governed by the Title IV process within the church. Of course, there's military justice, which has its own work. But just the same way, I mean, any perpetrator of harassment or abuse or assault may be liable not only to civil proceedings, but also church proceedings. There's a follow-up?
The military has an ability to cover over those events. So the church would have to be proactive in taking action on their own sponsored ministers.
Yes, and I think that's what the Title IV process allows. That's what it's designed to do. It's not a part of the military system. It's its own system of ecclesiastical discipline. Thank you. Yes?
I appreciate the gender-inclusive language and the recognition of homosexual rights for marriage and everything. But I wonder what kind of resolutions came forward recognizing people who don't fit the gender binary. Very often they have, specific issues regarding shelter and all kinds of things. If they want to go to a homeless shelter, they have difficulty, getting placement. Also, sometimes they're left out of discussions regarding marriage equality and the ability to be married.
There was a resolution which stated, which I'm not going to be able to name off the top of my head, but 10 guidelines for inclusion of transgender people and non-binary people in the church. And this resolution was mostly statements of affirmation of this is how we will be in relationship with people who identify as trans or non-binary. And there was an amendment added to it to develop a resource for how to live into those guidelines, which is calling for Integrity and Forma, the organization that I work with, to develop that curriculum or that more resources of how to actually do those sorts of things that you're talking about.
I'm interested in two things, and one is about the diocese in Cuba, and how the church's relationship may change now that this resolution was passed, and also about the translation into Spanish of the Book of Common Prayer. Let's start with Cuba. What do you expect?
Yeah, so convention acted, but it's still required that area of the this down. It requires that the Secretary of the General Convention receive some documentation according to that, in order for that to become a full diocese in the Episcopal Church. But we figure that they will be a diocese like Puerto Rico is a diocese, like Honduras is a diocese, so they'll become a full functioning diocese of the Episcopal Church. Any follow-up? Does that sound?
It's a process then.
It is a process. So the General Convention voted to say, yes, we want you back. We officially want you back. But there has to be something, they have to certify who's been ordained by what bishop. We have to, so there's a part of the process to make that happen, but yes. And then you had a question about translation.
Yes, I did. My daughter attends a church in Los Angeles where they have a service in Spanish, they have one in Korean, and they have one in English.
Yes.
And I've never attended their Spanish service. I don't know what they're using, or if they're using anything, but
So many Spanish-speaking congregations use the prayer book, and that's what they're authorized to use. But a lot of congregations will develop their own translations or adjustments to their translation. You might hear, even here, when we're presiding, even though we're not allowed to, sometimes the clergy will shift the word that we will use, or it'll just come out unintentionally that way. And so I certainly can't speak for that, but the task force is to include native speakers who are given the authority to do this translation work, not word for word, but thought for thought, to express more accurately what it sounds like, what we mean, what we believe in another language. Yes. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Any other questions? What other questions? Yes, Kathy.
I don't really have a question, but I did want to say another thing that happened at General Convention is the Episcopal Evangelism Services had a booth there with speakers, and that our church, St. Paul's Church, and the Prison Story Projects were recipients of a grant to tour the death row stories to high schools across Arkansas, so we're real proud of that.
That is wonderful news. And I saw one more question there.
There is a TEDx video going around social media promoting legalization of the sexual preference of pedophilia. Is there any discussion on that? Coming
Not
out of
at-
Germany mostly?
Not at General Convention. No. No, short. Any other questions? Yes.
This isn't really a question. I just want to say, you said you had about another hour's worth of information. Is there a possibility we'll do this again next Sunday and you'll give us the other?
Thank you. It's probably not next Sunday, but we might look for another way to communicate that with you. Yes, but we'll have something in the adult forum moment. That's a good question. You can go to generalconvention.org, and you can find every resolution that was considered, and you can search by theme. You can search for women, and it will show you all the resolutions that dealt with women or that had women in the text of the resolution, and you can track the process. What I would say is, if you would like more information on General Convention, on what happened, what I would ask you to do is to write down either the question that you have or the topic that is dear to you that you would like to hear more about, and give that to one of us, and we will look at that and figure out the best way to follow up on that. It might be, the adult forum might not be the opportunity, but there might be another opportunity for us to explore that, because there are lots of other things, as you say, that we certainly could have gotten into, but with 500 resolutions, we want to make sure that we're touching on what matters to the life of the church. And this was our first attempt. So if you want to go further, write down, don't tell us, because it'll go in one ear and out the other. Write down on a piece of paper what it is that you would like us to discuss, what questions you have, and the three of us will figure out what a good follow-up would be. Does that sound reasonable? Does that sound reasonable? All the way in the back? So the question is, having ventured west to this side of the Mississippi, what's my sense of the overall health of the Episcopal Church? I think it's a very, we live in a very healthy church. General Convention is one of those moments that the attention often falls to the disagreements and the disputes, but overwhelmingly, it's about sharing ministry. It's about sharing the commitment to the transforming work that God is doing in and among us through Jesus Christ. That's the work of the Episcopal Church. The election of the presiding bishop 3 years ago really kind of reflected a movement that was already taking hold in the church about focusing on love and evangelism in a clear way. The 3 years during which he's been our presiding bishop, as one of our presiding officers, he has shaped the work. It certainly was expressed there. I would say very healthy. We are a declining church in terms of numbers. We are a declining church in terms of influence in our community and in the world. We are a growing church in terms of our commitment to God and to what God is doing among us. We're a growing church in terms of how we are stripping away some of the layers of bureaucracy and getting where it really matters to the people in the pews and the ministries in our communities. And I think this current leadership has freed us up to do just that. And I see that. And I see that here in this diocese. I see that in Alabama and elsewhere as well. I was very grateful to Samantha and Suzanne, to Bishop Larry and the others for letting me kind of pal around with our Arkansas deputation, because I knew, of course, that I would be this side of the Mississippi very soon. So very healthy and very good. Thank you. Let's stand and close with a prayer, and then we'll head our ways. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, loving God, thank you for what you are doing in our church here in Fayetteville, in our church here in Arkansas, our church in this country, throughout the Episcopal Church, and indeed throughout the world. Thank you for letting us be a part of that. Give us a glimpse of the love that is changing lives and changing this world into the dream that you have for us. Watch us, guard us, bless us, and guide us into that work and into your reign. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Thank you all very much.